The blazing summer sun of 1876 cast long shadows across the main street of Fort Collins, Colorado, as Clara Osborne pressed a handkerchief to her lips, stifling a sob. The doctor's words still rang in her ears like a death knell. "I'm sorry, Miss Osborne, but your condition. You'll never be able to bear children." At 23, Clara had never considered herself particularly maternal, but the finality of the doctor's pronouncement had struck her like a physical blow. Clutching her reticule to her chest, she hurried past the general store, barely acknowledging the friendly greetings of other townspeople. Fort Collins was growing new settlers arriving weekly, bringing their hopes and dreams to this frontier town nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Everyone seemed to be building something: families, businesses, futures. Everyone except Clara. The diagnosis explained so much: the monthly pain that left her bedridden, the irregular cycles that had worried her since she was a girl. Her mother had attributed it to female troubles before she and Clara's father had succumbed to influenza 3 winters past, leaving Clara alone to run the small boarding house they had established when they first came west. "Miss Osborne," a voice called out, forcing Clara to compose herself. She turned to see Mrs. Thornton, one of the town's most notorious gossips, approaching with determined steps. "I heard that new teacher will be arriving on tomorrow's coach. Will you have room at your establishment?" Clara nodded automatically. "Yes, of course. I've prepared the blue room." Running the boarding house kept her busy, at least, even if it would never fill the emptiness the doctor had just confirmed would be her life's companion. "Splendid. And I do hope you'll join us for the social on Saturday. There are several unattached gentlemen new to town who I'm certain would—" "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton," Clara interrupted, unable to bear the woman's matchmaking today of all days. "But I have preparations to make for my new boarder, if you'll excuse me." As she walked away, Clara felt the weight of Mrs. Thornton's pitying gaze on her back. At 23, an unmarried woman on the frontier was already considered peculiar. Clara had deflected concerns with claims of being dedicated to her business, but the truth was simpler and more painful. No man would want a barren wife in a land where children were both joy and necessity, extra hands for work, security for one's old age, the future itself. Clara rounded the corner to her boarding house, a neat 2-story clapboard building with Osborne Lodging painted in careful letters above the door. Inside, the polished wooden floors gleamed with afternoon light streaming through lace curtains her mother had made. 4 guest rooms upstairs, with Clara's small quarters tucked behind the kitchen. It was a respectable living, especially with the town growing as it was, but today the familiar rooms felt like a prison sentence. She was startled from her thoughts by a loud commotion outside, the thunder of hooves and men shouting. Rushing to the window, Clara saw a rider on a lathered horse pull up in front of the doctor's office across the street. The man dismounted in a fluid motion, revealing broad shoulders under a dust-covered denim jacket. Even from a distance, Clara recognized Matthew Young, whose cattle ranch lay 10 miles outside of town. Matthew was supporting another man, who appeared to be bleeding heavily from his leg. "Doc Phillips," Matthew shouted, his voice carrying clearly through Clara's open window. "Ranch hand got himself gored by a bull." The doctor burst from his office, and together they carried the injured man inside. Clara watched Matthew's capable movements with reluctant admiration. He'd come to the territory 5 years ago and built one of the most successful ranches in the county through sheer determination and hard work. Townspeople spoke admiringly of his fairness to his men and his skill with cattle. They also noted his apparent lack of interest in settling down, despite being nearly 30 and, as Mrs. Thornton frequently observed, handsome enough to make a nun reconsider her vows. Clara had exchanged pleasantries with him on occasion when he came to town for supplies, but nothing more. She stepped away from the window, reminding herself that watching a neighbor assist an injured man wasn't proper behavior for a businesswoman. She had rooms to prepare and accounts to balance practical matters that required attention regardless of personal sorrows. By evening, Clara had managed to lose herself in work, cleaning and preparing the blue room for the new schoolteacher. The physical labor helped quiet her mind, though every time she fluffed a pillow or smoothed a quilt, unwelcome thoughts intruded. She would never prepare a nursery, never hold her own child. A knock at the front door startled her. The hour was late for callers, nearly 8 by the mantel clock. Clara smoothed her apron and went to answer. Matthew Young stood on her porch, his hat in his hands. The sunset painted his features in gold and shadow, highlighting a strong jawline partially obscured by a day's worth of stubble. His clothes were still dusty from the trail, but he'd clearly made some attempt to tidy himself. "Miss Osborne," he nodded politely. "I apologize for the hour." Clara clutched the door frame. "Is everything all right with your ranch hand? I saw you bring him to the doctor." Surprise flickered across Matthew's face. "Rodriguez will recover, thank you for asking. That's not why I'm here, though." He shifted his weight, displaying an uncharacteristic awkwardness for a man usually so assured. "Doc Phillips mentioned you might have a room available. The new schoolteacher is coming tomorrow, but another arrival beat her to it, my sister Hannah. She arrived on today's afternoon stage while I was dealing with Rodriguez." "Your sister?" Clara blinked in surprise. "I didn't know you had family coming." "Neither did I," Matthew said with a brief smile that transformed his weathered face. "She's decided the East doesn't suit her anymore. I'd take her to the ranch, but I've got 3 injured men to oversee and a herd to move to summer pasture." He hesitated. "It would just be for a week or two until I can make proper arrangements at the ranch." Clara found herself nodding. "Of course, I have the yellow room available." Business was business, after all, regardless of her personal sorrows. "She's welcome to come by this evening." Relief washed over Matthew's features. "She's at the hotel now, but I'll bring her first thing tomorrow. I appreciate this, Miss Osborne. Hannah can be strong-willed, but she's good-hearted." "I look forward to meeting her," Clara replied automatically. Matthew settled his hat back on his head. "Rodriguez told me what you did last winter, by the way, taking in those orphans during the blizzard when the stage couldn't continue on to Denver." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. Anyone would have done the same. "Not anyone," Matthew said quietly. "Those kids still talk about the lady who made them shadow puppets and hot chocolate when they were scared of the storm." The memory of those 3 days flashed through Clara's mind, the wide-eyed children huddled around her fireplace, as she entertained them with stories and simple games. The ache in her chest intensified. Children who weren't hers, who had continued on their journey to relatives in Denver once the passes cleared. "Good night, Mr. Young," Clara said, unable to maintain the conversation with her emotions so raw. "Matthew," he corrected gently. "After all, we'll be seeing more of each other with Hannah staying here." Clara nodded stiffly. "Good night, Matthew." She closed the door before he could see the tears threatening to fall. Outside, she heard the crunch of his boots on the gravel path, then the soft sounds of his horse moving away from the boarding house. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door, taking deep breaths until she regained her composure. The yellow room would need preparing for Hannah Young. Work was the only balm Clara had left, and she seized upon it gratefully. Morning brought a gentle knock at the front door just As Clara finished laying out breakfast for her current boarders, an elderly couple passing through on their way to visit grandchildren in Denver, and a land surveyor working for the railroad. Clara opened the door to find Matthew standing beside a young woman with the same striking blue eyes as her brother, though her chestnut hair contrasted with his darker shade. Hannah Young was perhaps 19 or 20, dressed in a fashionable traveling costume that had clearly seen better days after the long journey west. "Miss Osborne, may I present my sister, Hannah Young," Matthew said formally. "Hannah, this is Miss Clara Osborne, who has kindly agreed to provide you lodging." Hannah stepped forward with a warm smile. "Thank you so much for taking me in on such short notice. Matty was quite beside himself when I arrived yesterday." Matty. Clara couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Matthew's expression suggested he'd prefer to be anywhere else. "A childhood nickname I've been trying to leave behind for 20 years. Hannah's laugh was bright and infectious, and failing miserably. "I've brought all his embarrassing stories with me from Boston, Miss Osborne." "Clara, please," Clara found herself saying, warming to the young woman immediately. "Then you must call me Hannah. I suspect we'll become fast friends." Hannah's confident prediction seemed inevitable rather than presumptuous. Matthew cleared his throat. "I need to get back to the ranch. Hannah, I'll come check on you in a few days." "I'm not a child, Matty," Hannah replied, though her tone was affectionate. "I've crossed half a continent to get here. I think I can manage a few days in town." Something passed between the siblings, a shadow of an old argument, perhaps. Matthew finally nodded. "Miss Osborne, Clara, thank you again." After he departed, Clara showed Hannah to the yellow room. The young woman moved with an energy that seemed to fill the space, immediately unpacking her trunks and arranging her possessions. "My brother seems very taken with you," Hannah remarked casually as she hung a dress in the wardrobe. Clara nearly dropped the fresh towels she'd brought. "I beg your pardon." Hannah turned with a knowing smile. "Matthew doesn't usually bother learning people's first names unless he intends to know them better. He's been alone on that ranch for too long." "I think you misinterpret simple courtesy," Clara replied, fighting to keep her tone even. "Fort Collins is a small town. Everyone knows everyone, if you say so." Hannah didn't appear convinced. "Though I should warn you, my arrival isn't entirely coincidental. I came because I'm worried about him. Our parents died 5 years ago, that's when he came west. I stayed with our aunt in Boston, but we've exchanged letters regularly." She sat on the edge of the bed. "His letters changed about a year ago. They became emptier. Just facts about the ranch, the weather, none of the humor or observations that used to fill them." Clara wasn't sure why Hannah was confiding in her. Perhaps he's just busy. Running a cattle ranch isn't easy work. No, it's more than that. Hannah's bright demeanor dimmed slightly. "I think he's lonely but too stubborn to admit it, so I decided to come shake things up a bit." Clara arranged the towels on the washstand. "Well, I'm certain your presence will cheer him. Now, breakfast is served until 9, and you're welcome to use the parlor downstairs. The new school teacher arrives today, so you'll have company your own age." Hannah's expression made it clear she wasn't finished discussing her brother, but Clara made a hasty retreat. The last thing she needed was to develop any kind of attachment to Matthew Young, especially now that she knew for certain she could never give him or any man a family. The afternoon stage brought the new school teacher, Miss Abigail Turner, a sensible woman of 30 with spectacles and a quick smile. Clara helped her settle into the blue room, grateful for the distraction of new arrivals. By evening, Hannah and Abigail were chatting like old friends in the parlor while Clara caught up on mending. 3 days passed in relative quiet. Hannah proved to be a delightful guest, helping Clara with chores despite assurances that paying boarders weren't expected to work. The young woman confessed that, after years of formal Boston society, she found simple tasks like kneading bread or beating rugs satisfying. On the fourth day, Clara was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the back door burst open without warning. Matthew stood in the doorway, his face ashen beneath his tan. "Hannah," he gasped. "Is she here?" Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course. She's upstairs reading. What's wrong?" Relief washed over his features, followed immediately by anger. "That foolish girl. She left a note saying she was riding out to the ranch to see me. When she didn't arrive," he broke off, running a hand through his hair. "I thought she might have gotten lost or hurt on the way." Clara frowned. "She's been here all day. I saw her at breakfast and lunch." A thunderous expression crossed Matthew's face as he strode toward the stairs. "Hannah Young," he called up. "Come down here this instant." Hannah appeared at the top of the stairs, a book in hand and an all too innocent expression on her face. "Maddie, what a lovely surprise." "Don't Maddie me," he growled. "I've been riding for 2 hours looking for you, the note you left." "Oh." Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. "I wrote that yesterday, but then decided the weather looked threatening. I must have forgotten to destroy it, and the wind blew it somewhere you'd find it." Her contrite expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm so sorry to have worried you." Clara didn't believe Hannah's explanation for a second, and from Matthew's stormy expression, neither did he. But arguing with his sister in front of Clara clearly made him uncomfortable. "May we use your parlor for a moment, Miss Osborne?" he asked stiffly. Clara nodded, retreating to the kitchen where she busied herself with dinner preparations while trying not to eavesdrop on the heated whispers coming from the other room. The conversation ended abruptly with Hannah marching upstairs and Matthew returning to the kitchen, his expression still dark. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said formally. Clara handed him a cup of coffee without thinking. "She's young and spirited. I suspect she misses you." Matthew accepted the cup, some of the tension easing from his shoulders as he took a sip. "She's manipulative is what she is, always has been." Despite his harsh words, there was fondness in his tone. "Hannah thinks I need looking after." "All sisters believe that about their brothers," Clara said, thinking of her own brothers who had scattered to different territories after their parents died, keeping in touch through infrequent letters. Matthew studied her over the rim of his cup. "You have siblings?" "2 brothers. James is in Oregon Territory. William joined the Army and was last stationed in Arizona." Clara turned back to the stove, uncomfortable under his steady gaze. "We write, but distance makes it difficult to remain close." "Yes, it does." Something in his voice made her turn back. Matthew was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Hannah tells me you've been very kind to her." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "She's a delightful girl." "She can be," Matthew agreed with a small smile. "When she's not causing me to panic and ride across the countryside looking for her." Clara found herself smiling in return. "Would you like to stay for dinner? There's plenty." The invitation surprised them both. Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that, thank you." Dinner was a lively affair, with Hannah chattering about Boston society and Abigail sharing stories of her previous teaching positions. The elderly couple had departed that morning, but the land surveyor contributed tales of the territories he'd mapped. Matthew was quieter, but Clara noticed how his gaze often drifted to her when he thought she wasn't looking. After the meal, Hannah convinced everyone to play whist in the parlor. Clara found herself partnered with Matthew against Hannah and Abigail. The casual domestic scene felt dangerously comfortable, especially when Matthew's fingers brushed against hers as they exchanged cards. "Your establishment is very well run," Matthew commented as they tallied points after the third hand. I've stayed in hotels in Denver that weren't half as comfortable. My parents started it, Clara replied, keeping her eyes on the cards. Mother always said that a clean bed and a good meal were all most travelers truly needed. She was right, Matthew agreed. Though I think your success comes from more than just that. You make people feel welcome. The simple compliment warmed Clara more than it should have. She reminded herself sharply that friendly conversation was just that, friendly. Nothing more could come of any feelings that might develop. When the evening ended and Matthew prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I was wondering if you might like to attend the town social on Saturday," he said, his voice carefully casual. "Hannah will need an escort, and I thought perhaps we could all go together." Before Clara could formulate a response, Hannah appeared beside them. "What a wonderful idea! Abigail has already agreed to accompany us as well." Clara found herself cornered. "That would be lovely," she said, though her heart twisted painfully. One evening of pretending wouldn't hurt, she told herself. Just one evening of imagining a different future than the one laid out for her. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect weather for the social. Clara spent longer than usual preparing, finally selecting her best dress, a deep blue silk that her mother had insisted she keep for special occasions. Hannah helped arrange her hair, chattering excitedly about the potential dancing partners she hoped to meet. Matthew arrived precisely at 7, dressed in clean denims and a pressed white shirt with a string tie. He'd clearly visited the barber, his jaw clean-shaven and hair neatly trimmed. When Clara descended the stairs, his eyes widened appreciatively. "You look beautiful," he said simply. Clara fought against the pleasure his words evoked. "Thank you. Shall we go?" The town hall was decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers, tables of food lining one wall while a small group of musicians tuned their instruments in the corner. It seemed all of Fort Collins had turned out for the event, from the youngest children to the oldest residents. Clara found herself genuinely enjoying the evening, despite her initial reservations. She danced with several partners, including the land surveyor who boarded with her, but couldn't help noticing how her gaze kept seeking out Matthew across the room. After an hour, he finally approached her during a lull between dances. "May I have this next dance?" he asked, offering his hand. Clara hesitated only briefly before placing her fingers in his. "I should warn you, I'm not particularly accomplished." Matthew's smile was warm. "That makes two of us. We can be unaccomplished together." As the musicians struck up a waltz, Matthew's hand settled at her waist, maintaining a respectful distance while still close enough that Clara could detect the clean scent of soap and the faint smell of leather that seemed to cling to him. His large hand enveloped hers, calloused from ranch work but gentle in its touch. "Your sister appears to be enjoying herself," Clara observed, nodding toward Hannah, who was surrounded by young men vying for her attention. Matthew chuckled. "She always does." "I fear half the young men in town will be heartbroken when she returns to Boston." Clara looked up in surprise. "She's not staying." "She hasn't said as much, but Hannah isn't made for frontier life," Matthew replied, skillfully guiding Clara through a turn. "She thrives on society and conversation. There's precious little of either at the ranch." "You seem to manage well enough without them," Clara said. Matthew's expression grew thoughtful. "Do I? Sometimes I wonder." His eyes, startlingly blue in the lantern light, met hers. "I've been thinking about coming to town more often." Clara's heart stuttered in her chest. "For supplies?" she asked, knowing full well that wasn't his meaning. A small smile played at his lips. "Among other things." The music drew to a close, and Matthew stepped back, though he kept hold of her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for the dance, Clara." "You're welcome, Matthew," she replied, his name still feeling unfamiliar on her lips. They were interrupted by Mrs. Thornton, who appeared with remarkable timing and a determined expression. "Miss Osborne, Mr. Young, what a lovely surprise to see you together." Her emphasis on the word "together" was about as subtle as a stampeding buffalo. "Mr. Young, I was just telling Reverend Parker about your generous donation for the new church bells. Perhaps you could share the story with him directly." Her tone made it clear this wasn't actually a request. Matthew looked as if he might refuse, but years of frontier courtesy prevailed. "Of course, Mrs. Thornton." He turned to Clara. "Save me another dance." Before Clara could answer, Mrs. Thornton had whisked him away, leaving Clara standing alone at the edge of the dance floor. She made her way to the refreshment table, trying to ignore the speculation she could feel in the gazes following her. In a town the size of Fort Collins, being seen dancing with an eligible bachelor like Matthew Young was enough to start tongues wagging. "He's quite taken with you," came Hannah's voice as the younger woman appeared beside Clara, fanning herself after an energetic reel. Clara handed her a cup of punch. "Your brother is simply being polite." Hannah's laugh was genuine. "Matty wouldn't know how to be simply polite if his life depended on it. He says exactly what he thinks and does exactly what he wants." She sipped her punch, watching Clara over the rim of her cup. "And right now, what he wants is to know you better." Clara set her own cup down with more force than intended. "Hannah, please, your brother and I barely know each other." "That's generally how courtships begin," Hannah replied with exaggerated patience, "with getting to know one another." "There is no courtship," Clara said firmly, though the word sent a pang through her chest. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need some air." She slipped outside, away from the music and laughter, finding a quiet spot on the small porch that wrapped around the town hall. The night air was cool after the warmth of the dance, and Clara drew a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The door opened behind her and Clara turned, expecting to see Hannah. Instead, Matthew stepped onto the porch, concern etched on his features. "Are you all right?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. "Hannah mentioned you seemed upset." Clara forced a smile. "I'm fine, truly, just needed a moment away from the crowd." Matthew nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I feel the same way sometimes. Too many people, too much noise." He moved to the porch railing, looking out at the quiet Main Street. "That's part of why I came west, I think. Space to breathe." Clara joined him at the railing, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Is that why you started your ranch?" "Partly," Matthew admitted. "After our parents died, I couldn't bear to stay in Boston. Every street, every building held memories." He glanced at her. "Hannah told me you lost your parents as well." 3 years ago, Clara confirmed. "Influenza." Matthew's expression softened with understanding. "It changes you, doesn't it?" "Losing them?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "It does." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the music from inside creating a muffled backdrop to the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. "Clara," Matthew began hesitantly, "I was wondering if perhaps tomorrow you might—" The door burst open, and several giggling couples spilled onto the porch, breaking the moment. Matthew straightened, his expression shifting back to polite neutrality. "We should go back inside," Clara suggested, already regretting the interruption even as she reminded herself it was for the best. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of dances and conversation. Matthew claimed one more dance, but they were surrounded by other couples, making private conversation impossible. When the social finally wound down near midnight, Matthew escorted Clara, Hannah, and Abigail back to the boarding house. At the door, Hannah tactfully drew Abigail inside, leaving Clara and Matthew alone on the porch. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Clara said formally. Matthew studied her face in the soft light spilling from the windows. "I meant to ask earlier before we were interrupted. Would you consider joining Hannah and me for a picnic tomorrow? I thought we might drive out to the lake." The invitation was innocent enough with Hannah as chaperone, entirely proper. Yet Clara knew accepting would only deepen the connection forming between them, a connection that could lead nowhere but heartbreak. "I'm afraid I have responsibilities here," she began, the excuse sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Just for the afternoon," Matthew pressed gently. "The weather's perfect and Hannah's been cooped up in town all week." Put that way, refusing seemed churlish. Clara found herself nodding. All right, for Hannah's sake. Something in Matthew's eyes suggested he understood her unspoken reservation, though he couldn't know its true nature. "For Hannah's sake," he agreed, though his smile told a different story. "I'll come by at noon." After he'd gone, Clara leaned against the closed door, her heart racing with equal parts anticipation and dread. One afternoon, she told herself. One afternoon of pretending a normal life was possible before she returned to reality. The lake Matthew had mentioned lay about 5 miles outside of town, a small, pristine body of water nestled among rolling hills. The journey there in Matthew's wagon was filled with Hannah's cheerful chatter, leaving Clara free to enjoy the scenery and Matthew's occasional comments about the land they passed. The picnic spot he chose offered shade from a stand of cottonwoods and a stunning view of the lake's crystal waters. Hannah immediately kicked off her shoes and waded ankle-deep, declaring the water perfectly refreshing and trying to convince the others to join her. "She's always been like this," Matthew confided to Clara as they spread a blanket under the trees. "Impulsive, fearless. Our mother used to say Hannah was born without the sense God gave a goose, but with twice the charm to make up for it." Clara laughed, unpacking the basket of food she'd prepared. "She's delightful. You're fortunate to have such a close relationship despite the distance." Matthew's expression grew serious. "We haven't always been close. After our parents died, I wasn't in a good place. Coming west was selfish in many ways. Hannah needed me, but I needed to escape more." He arranged the plates Clara had brought, his movements deliberate. "I've carried that guilt for 5 years. You were grieving," Clara said softly. "We all respond to loss differently." Matthew looked up, meeting her gaze. "How did you respond?" The question was gentle but direct. Clara found herself answering honestly. "I threw myself into the boarding house. Every waking hour was spent working, cleaning, cooking, keeping accounts. If I was exhausted at night, I didn't have to think about them being gone." "And now?" Matthew asked. Clara shrugged slightly. "The work is still there, still necessary, but sometimes I wonder." She trailed off, unwilling to voice her deepest fears that work alone would never be enough to fill a lifetime, especially one without the family she'd always assumed would be her future. Hannah returned from the water's edge, saving Clara from having to complete her thought. The young woman flopped dramatically onto the blanket, her hair coming loose from its pins. "This is glorious," she declared. "Maddie, why didn't you tell me there were places like this near your ranch? All your letters made it sound like nothing but dust and cattle." "Because I knew you'd want to visit if I did," Matthew replied dryly, handing her a sandwich. "Eat something before you expire from excitement." The meal passed pleasantly, with Hannah entertaining them with stories of Boston society, and Matthew occasionally adding his own recollections of their childhood. Clara found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn into the siblings' easy banter. After they'd eaten, Hannah announced her intention to explore the shoreline. "Don't worry, I won't go far," she assured them when Matthew frowned. "Just around that next bend. I want to see if there are any interesting shells or stones." As Hannah wandered off, Clara began repacking the basket, aware of Matthew watching her. "Your sister isn't very subtle," she commented. Matthew chuckled. "No, subtlety has never been Hannah's strong suit." He hesitated, then added more seriously, "Though I can't say I mind her giving us a moment alone." Clara's hand stilled on the basket. "Matthew, Clara," he interrupted gently, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I find myself thinking about you more than is probably wise. I'd like the chance to court you properly if you're willing." The words Clara had been dreading. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering her courage. "I'm flattered, truly, but I don't think that would be wise." "Because of the boarding house?" Matthew asked, confusion evident in his voice. "I wouldn't ask you to give up your business. We could find an arrangement that—" "No," Clara interrupted, her voice strained. "It's not that." She took a deep breath. "Matthew, I can't have children. Ever. The doctor confirmed it last week." The words hung in the air between them. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the blanket, unable to bear the disappointment she knew would be written across his face. "I see," Matthew said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "And you believe this makes you unsuitable?" Clara looked up, startled by the question. "Of course it does." "What man wants a wife who can't give him a family?" Matthew's expression was thoughtful rather than dismayed. "Clara, I've lived alone on my ranch for 5 years. I have 40 hands working for me during the busy seasons. If I wanted just anyone to bear children and continue my name, I could have married long ago." He moved closer, taking her hand gently in his. "I'm interested in courting you because of who you are, your kindness, your strength, the way you've built a life for yourself despite loss. Those qualities have nothing to do with whether or not you can bear children." Clara blinked back unexpected tears. "You say that now, but someday, none of us knows what the future holds," Matthew interrupted. "All I know is that right now I'd like the chance to know you better. The rest we can face together if it comes to that." The sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable. Clara found herself nodding slowly. "All right, but slowly, please." Matthew's smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains. "As slow as you need." He squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "Now, perhaps we should check on Hannah before she decides to swim across the lake." As if summoned by her name, Hannah came racing around the bend, waving excitedly. "Maddie, Clara, you have to see this. There's a family of ducks with the tiniest ducklings you've ever seen." Matthew stood, offering Clara his hand to help her up. The simple gesture and the natural way their fingers intertwined after she rose felt like a promise, tentative but real. The courtship progressed slowly through the summer months, just as Clara had requested. Matthew came to town at least twice a week, often under the pretense of checking on Hannah, who showed no signs of returning to Boston despite occasional wistful references to proper tea and cultural events. Their outings were always proper walks through town, Sunday services followed by dinner at the boarding house, occasional picnics with Hannah as chaperone. Clara found herself looking forward to Matthew's visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. Despite his assurances, she couldn't help but worry that eventually he would come to regret choosing a woman who couldn't give him children. One evening in late August, Matthew arrived at the boarding house looking troubled. Hannah had finally returned to Boston the week before, extracting promises from both Matthew and Clara to write regularly. "What's wrong?" Clara asked as they sat in the parlor, the windows open to catch the evening breeze. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Rodriguez, the hand who was injured earlier this summer, his wife just had their 4th child, a healthy boy." "That's wonderful news," Clara said cautiously, not understanding his distress. "It is," Matthew agreed, But when I congratulated him, he said something that's been bothering me. He said, "Boss, there's no greater blessing than holding your own child. I hope you know that joy someday." Clara felt as though she'd been doused with ice water. "I see," she said stiffly, rising from her chair. "Matthew, if you've reconsidered—" "No." Matthew stood quickly, catching her hand. "Clara, that's not it at all. I realized something today. Rodriguez is right, children are a blessing, but they're not the only blessing." His blue eyes held hers intently. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. I don't need anything more than what we have to feel fulfilled." Clara wanted desperately to believe him. "You say that now, and I'll say it 10 years from now and 20, Matthew insisted. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I had planned to do this differently, somewhere more romantic than your parlor, but I can't wait another day." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. "Clara Osborne, I love you. I want to share my life with you, whatever that life may hold. Will you marry me?" Clara stared at the simple gold band nestled in the box. "Matthew, are you certain, truly certain?" "More certain than I've been of anything in my life," he replied without hesitation. Tears filled Clara's eyes as she whispered, "Yes." The wedding took place in October, when the aspens had turned to gold and the first hint of winter crispness filled the air. Clara sold the boarding house to Abigail Turner, who had decided teaching wasn't her true calling after all. The proceeds, combined with her savings, provided Clara with a modest dowry that she insisted on contributing to their shared future, though Matthew assured her it wasn't necessary. Life at the ranch was an adjustment, the isolation, the rhythm of cattle work, the responsibility of overseeing a household staff of 3 who helped manage the sprawling main house. Yet Clara found she loved the wide open spaces and the quiet evenings spent with Matthew before the fire, planning improvements to the property, or simply enjoying each other's company. Their physical relationship developed with the same care and consideration that had marked their courtship. Matthew was tender and patient, and Clara discovered depths of passion she hadn't known existed within her. If their lovemaking sometimes ended with a tinge of sadness, the knowledge that it would never result in new life, neither of them spoke of it directly. Christmas brought a letter from Hannah, full of news from Boston and thinly veiled inquiries about a potential niece or nephew. Clara read it with a mixture of amusement and pain, grateful when Matthew simply kissed her temple and said, "Hannah has never been one for patience." Winter on the high plains was harsh, with blizzards that sometimes isolated the ranch for days at a time. Yet Clara found she didn't mind being snowbound with Matthew. They used the quiet time to read aloud to each other, play chess, and plan for spring improvements to the house and garden. It was during one such blizzard in February that Clara first noticed the changes in her body, subtle shifts that she initially attributed to the rich food their cook prepared during the cold months. When her monthly courses failed to arrive, she dismissed it as the irregularity that had plagued her all her life. Even the occasional waves of nausea were easy to blame on winter cabin fever. By March, however, Clara could no longer ignore the signs. Terrified to hope, she rode into town during a clear spell to see Doc Phillips. The doctor's examination was thorough, his questions precise. When he finally sat back with a bemused expression, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "Well, Miss Osborne, Mrs. Young, I should say it appears I was mistaken in my diagnosis last year." Clara clutched the edge of the examination table. "What do you mean? You're with child, Mrs. Young. About 3 months along, I'd estimate." The doctor's expression was a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine happiness. Sometimes nature finds a way to surprise us all. Clara's journey back to the ranch passed in a daze of disbelief and cautious joy. She decided not to tell Matthew immediately, fearing that her condition might still prove to be something else, some cruel trick of fate. But as spring bloomed across the plains, and her body continued to change, her waistline thickening, her breasts becoming tender, Clara could no longer deny the miracle growing within her. On a warm evening in April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink, she finally gathered her courage. "Matthew," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, his expression open and curious. "What is it, love?" Clara took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach, where the slightest curve was now evident beneath her dress. "We're going to have a baby." Matthew's face transformed from confusion to wonder to overwhelming joy in the span of seconds. "A baby." "But the doctor said—" "He was wrong," Clara said simply. "I've seen him twice now to confirm it. The baby should arrive in early September." Matthew's eyes filled with tears as he dropped to his knees before her chair, pressing his face against her stomach. "A miracle," he whispered. "Our miracle." Clara stroked his hair, her own tears falling freely. "I still can't quite believe it." Matthew looked up at her, his face alight with a joy so pure it took her breath away. "I'd have been content with just you, Clara. You know that, don't you? This child is a blessing I never dared hope for, but you were already all the blessing I needed." "I know," Clara said, and she did. Through all the months of their marriage, Matthew had never once made her feel lacking or incomplete. His love had been steadfast, his commitment unwavering. The pregnancy progressed well through the summer months. Matthew hovered anxiously, insisting Clara rest frequently and hiring additional help for the house so she wouldn't overexert herself. Clara indulged his protectiveness, touched by his concern even as she assured him that women had been having babies on the frontier since long before doctors and modern conveniences. Hannah returned from Boston in August, determined to be present for the birth of her niece or nephew. Her presence was a welcome distraction during the final uncomfortable weeks of waiting, her stories and energy filling the house with laughter. The labor began on a clear September morning, just as the first leaves were beginning to turn. It was long and difficult, stretching through the day and into the night. Matthew paced the hallway outside their bedroom, Hannah beside him offering what comfort she could, as the midwife and Doc Phillips attended Clara. Shortly after midnight, a lusty cry pierced the tense silence of the house. Matthew froze, his face a study in terror and hope. Minutes later, the bedroom door opened and Doc Phillips emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "Congratulations, Mr. Young," he said with a broad smile. "You have a healthy son." Matthew swayed slightly, Hannah's hand on his arm steadying him. "And Clara, tired but well," the doctor assured him. "She's asking for you." Matthew entered the bedroom with tentative steps. Clara lay propped against the pillows, her face pale with exhaustion but radiant with joy. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, lay a tiny red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your son," Clara whispered as Matthew approached. With trembling hands, Matthew took the swaddled bundle, cradling it with infinite care. The baby squinted up at him, tiny features scrunched in what might have been confusion or contemplation. "He's perfect," Matthew breathed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Thank you, Clara. Thank you for this gift." He sank onto the edge of the bed, one arm holding their son while the other reached for Clara's hand. "I never thought," he began, his voice breaking with emotion. "I know," Clara said softly. "Neither did I." Matthew looked heavenward, his expression one of profound gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for this miracle," he whispered. "For our son, for Clara's strength, for this life we share." Clara squeezed his hand, her own heart echoing the prayer. Against all odds, against medical certainty, they had created this new life together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family, the family she had once believed impossible. "What shall we name him?" Matthew asked, gazing down at their son with wonder. Clara smiled, stroking the baby's soft cheek. "I thought perhaps Thomas, after your father." "Thomas," Matthew repeated, testing the name. "Thomas Young, I think it suits him." Hannah appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with excitement. "May I meet my nephew?" Matthew beckoned her in, carefully transferring the baby to her eager arms. "Hannah, meet Thomas." As Hannah cooed over the infant, Matthew slid onto the bed beside Clara, gathering her gently against his side. "I love you," he murmured against her hair, "more than I can ever express." Clara leaned into his embrace, watching their son in Hannah's arms. The journey that had brought them to this moment, from her devastating diagnosis to their cautious courtship to this miraculous birth, seemed almost dreamlike in its perfection. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Thank you for believing in us when I couldn't." Years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising. The ranch prospered under Matthew and Clara's combined management, his practical knowledge of cattle and her head for business proving a formidable combination. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. To everyone's astonishment, Clara gave birth to twin girls when Thomas was 4, disproving the doctor's original diagnosis so thoroughly that he kept their case notes to share with medical colleagues. Elizabeth and Catherine Young arrived on a spring morning, filling the ranch house with twice the crying, twice the laundry, and twice the joy. Hannah divided her time between Boston and Colorado, never quite settling permanently in either place, but bringing energy and stories wherever she went. The children adored their aunt, who spoiled them shamelessly with gifts from the East and taught them songs and games that sometimes made Clara raise an eyebrow. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Matthew surprised Clara with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since Thomas was born. With Hannah overseeing the children and Rodriguez managing the ranch, they spent 2 glorious weeks exploring the city, attending the theater, and simply enjoying uninterrupted time together. On their final night, sitting on a hotel balcony overlooking the bay, Matthew took Clara's hand, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about that day at the lake, when you told me you couldn't have children?" Clara smiled, the memory no longer painful. "Sometimes. I was so certain my life was set on one path." Matthew lifted her hand to his lips. "I knew even then that I wanted a life with you, children or no children. That was never the question for me." "I know that now," Clara said softly, "though I'm grateful every day for our 3 miracles." "As am I," Matthew agreed, his gaze moving to the moonlight reflecting on the water. "But you, Clara Young, were my first miracle. The children are simply additional blessings." Clara leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like the gentle waves below. Their life together wasn't perfect. There had been hardships, arguments, challenges that tested them both. But through it all, their commitment had remained unshakable, their love deepening with each passing year. "When we return home," she said, "I want to take the children to the lake. Thomas is old enough now to remember it, and the girls would love the ducklings." Matthew chuckled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "The place where it all truly began. I think that's a fine idea." Clara closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the sound of the ocean, the warmth of Matthew beside her, the knowledge that their family waited for them back in Colorado. From despair to unimaginable joy, her life's journey had taken her places she'd never dared to dream possible. And it had all started with a doctor's mistaken diagnosis, and a cowboy who loved her exactly as she was complete, worthy, enough regardless of what her body could or couldn't do. "Thank you," she whispered, the words meant for Matthew, for the universe, for whatever divine hand had guided their paths together. "For what?" Matthew asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Clara smiled, opening her eyes to meet his gaze, still as blue, still as loving as the first day he'd proposed in her parlor. "For everything. For believing when I couldn't. For our children. For these 10 years. For all the years still to come." Matthew's answering smile held all the promise of those future years, the children growing, the ranch expanding, their love continuing to flourish in the wide open spaces they both had come to cherish. "Always," he said simply. "Always."